Hey everybody, it's Friday, March the 29th, 2024. Good Friday. And this is How to Restart a Church, a spin-off podcast where I, Pastor Trey Comstock, and my dear friend and colleague, Pastor Emily Larson, talk about how to make church happen and how to make church happen again. Today, we are going to talk about a thing that has floated around the world, a conversation that has floated around the world of mainline, that is your Methodists, Presbyterians, Lutherans, Episcopalians, church for a long time. And that is the idea of part-time or bivocational clergy. Specifically, we're going to be looking at an article by Jeffery MacDonald, who is a UCC pastor, writer for RMS, Religion News Service, who we pull a lot of content from. They write about a lot of things that we care about. He put out an article last week that is full-time ministry, or 2 weeks ago now. Anyways, full-time ministry drains too many clergy and church budgets. Part-time pastors can help. He writes some version of this article periodically, as he literally wrote a book about it entitled Part-Time is Plenty, Thriving Without Full-Time Clergy. This article is interesting because it doesn't just say, it says one of the things that is, and we'll talk more about this as this episode progresses, but like the economics of supporting a full-time pastor in a livable wage kind of situation is just expensive.
Right.
It's
not what it used to be, friends.
Especially if you want to do ministry where in either like low resource environments, which is what we do here at Servants of Christ, or do something that is like new and you don't know if it's going to work or not. Well, it really helps if you're not trying to afford a middle-class professional salary on top of that. The thing that Jeffery MacDonald brings into this conversation is also like part-time pastors seem to be emotionally healthier and happier than full-time pastors. That when there is something about full-time ministry where often congregations will then expect that, and I can resonate with a lot of this because I've done both versions of this. Like there's an expectation, you're full time. And so you are the designated religious person. We pay you to be religious so that we don't have to. Jeffrey doesn't put it that bluntly, but he, talks about like, congregations often do a better job of coming alongside and working alongside a part-time pastor because you understand that they are part-time as everyone is part-time. And that part-time pastors seem genuinely happier and healthier, both physically and emotionally, than full-time pastors. And he draws out, looking at a lot of statistics, and I've read these same things, that like the majority of full-time clergy have thought about leaving the ministry. That's not true for part-time pastors. That
for part-time clergy.
That full-time clergy are much more burnt out, or much just psychologically unhealthy, or much less likely to have a life than part-time clergy. And so
that's my favorite line in the whole thing is that, so in those arrangements, pastors gain the mental health benefits of having friendships and responsibilities. In other words, a life outside of the church, right? Like, yes, like maybe you should also have some balance in your life. Like, yes, church is important. Yes, your vocation, your calling is important. Working full-time for a church is important. But also, maybe there should be some balance there. Just that subtle jab of like, maybe there are people too.
He's 100% right about that. Even if, set aside his conclusion, and therefore more part-time pastors, I think there is some double-edgedness to this. But I have found that in my own life. And for me, I'm not currently a part-time clergy. I have been part-time. At the very beginning of my career, I was part-time. But even in just moving from a world where the only reason why I live in this place is to do this job, and the house in which I live is owned by the church, to a world where I am in the city that I would choose to live in, whether I had this job or not. It is my home city. It is, right. I love cities. I know not everyone does. I do. And I live in a house that I exchange money with a landlord for. Right, when the landlord isn't the church, it's my next door neighbor. It's very, literally, my landlord lives next door.
Handy.
It's handy. This guy literally bought the house next door to him and rented it out, and works out really well for me. And I live in a lovely house in Meyerland, part of Houston. Anyways, even that version of getting a life back made a huge difference in my overall outlook. The getting closer to, again, still full time, but less of that, being a mainline clergy, especially when you live in a parsonage, especially when the only reason why you live in a place is because of this vocation, that right. I found that incredibly destructive in my life.
Well, and I think you really hit on it about the people coming alongside and how much people are willing to come and do with you if you are part-time versus full-time. It really has, as much to do with it financially. So I have been in churches that have a ton of money, and I have been in churches that don't have 2 dimes to rub together. And I've worked ministries on both sides of the spectrum. And I will tell you that it is much better for my mental health to work in the churches that are in the trenches that don't have any money. Because when I worked in one instance where I worked at a church that had way too much money and didn't know what to do with it all. I remember asking for volunteers, not even for very hard things, like for friends in faith, for confirmation, for example. And the person that I had asked about being a mentor to this student, discipling this child along in their faith journey, said, well, why don't we just pay someone else to do that? And I went, you have completely missed the point of discipleship. This is it's not about who's got the time to do it or the money to do it. It's not about, that's not a thing you outsource, right? Discipleship is not a thing you outsource. And so, but I think you're right that a lot of times those congregations that are in it, that are scrappy young folks trying to make it, are much more willing to come alongside and carry the burden of discipleship and the responsibility of the church along with their clergy, who is expected to be their part-time.
So I saw this play out in my first clergy job. So my first clergy job was I was the first part-time pastor in a generation at Smith Chapel United Methodist Church. My immediate predecessor had been full-time. Her immediate predecessor had been full-time, on, right? It had been what we in Methodist world would call a full-time appointment. And it had all just gone bad, and the money wasn't there in the system to support literally what this guy is talking about, right? What Jeffery MacDonald is talking about. The money just wasn't there in the system to afford, the minimum salary in the North Georgia Conference at that time was $42,000 plus health and pension. And so 60 grand, more or less. And, this was a church whose whole budget was 70 grand. Because there was other than the pastor, there was almost no other costs. They owned that land outright and had for 100 years. The parsonage had been donated by a very wealthy family back in the 80s. So, there was some maintenance stuff. There was electricity and insurance and end of list, right? So, the pastor's salary, there was no other staff. When I got there, it was a congregation of 40 folks. Yeah. They had very few other costs. That budget was the pastor. And so in bringing me in, we went, and I'll just name numbers because whatever, this was 10 years ago. And so I was 50% time. So I made 20 grand. Now, they didn't have to give me health insurance. I had health insurance through my work. It was bivocational. I was also a research assistant and worked in the Office of Worship at Emory University. Was a full-time grad student. So I was bivocational. I worked, both studied at and worked at Emory during 3.5 days a week, and was at Smith Chapel United Methodist Church the other 3.5 days a week. So I had health insurance, just not through them. It's another thing they didn't have to pay for. And that allowed us, the church grew because we worked together, right? And that congregation stepped up and worked with a guy like me, this kind of urban 27-year-old at a congregation in a place he'd never heard of. But like folks lifted incredible amount of work done by laity. And we worked together, and I worked real hard too, but I could have done all that by myself. And they didn't stop giving, and that church went from gonna die because they owed the conference benefits money to building a savings account and being able to hire a musician to attempt a contemporary service that didn't quite work out, but actually then what they ended up with was a blended, after I left, was a blended service. And that church was 6 months from closing and now 10 years later is still open. Right? I mean, it's exactly what this guy is describing, and I've seen it play out.
It's incredibly indicative to me when you go to a church like that. Are the people willing to put out the chairs for the service, right?
Yeah.
Like, are they willing to do the thing? Or are they just going to hire a facilities guy to do it? Or are they just going to expect the pastor to do it because that's what the pastor's supposed to do?
Oh, shoot. This church, one of the guys' tithe was he mowed. He did the mowing. They had a graveyard too. So they had a fair amount of property. Not like, they had a few acres, right? It was not like a quarter-acre lot or whatever. And they mowed, like Howard, I forget his last name. Howard's tithe he was a retired truck driver. And he really just kind of like sitting on a machine and steering. Like that was just a real happy place for Howard. And so Howard mowed. We didn't have to pay a mower.
Gotta be done. There you go.
And he's a retired guy, and he was just, I think at some point we ended up buying a we talked about buying a lawnmower because Howard did get tired of schlepping his mower there. But but because we saved so much money by moving to a halftime clergy, we could buy a lawnmower.
Right. Make it a little easier for Howard.
I was reading this and it brought me to think about, I lived this model that Jeffery MacDonald is proposing for the first 2 years of my ministry. And there were hard moments, absolutely. But I also remember it being there was real joy in it. And I did have a life, right? I would go back to my apartment in Atlanta and my life as a grad student and researcher, and I would be sitting in on conversations about religion and public health, and I had my on-campus friends, and I had a life.
Right.
And
I had life outside of.
And a life outside of it. And I was living apart from my spouse 3.5 days a week, and that was hard. But I see. I don't necessarily think it's a panacea. I don't think it's going to solve all the problems.
Right.
But also, he's got a point.
Right. There is a real point there. And one of the things that comes up, because you and I have also lived the life of part-time here plus part-time here plus part-time here equals full-time job. And that can become difficult as well. Because when you are a full-time pastor, but you're part-time for this congregation over here, and this congregation over here didn't quite understand the division of labor between the congregations, that can be difficult as well. Unless there's an understanding of, yes, I am your pastor and your pastor and your pastor. Old circuit riders, right? United Methodism. We know about circuit riding.
Well, this is, place. One of the weird themes that runs through this podcast is we had a model for ministry And we wholesale abandoned it sometime in the late 19th century. And now here in the early 20th century, that's all coming home to roost. Because a lot of, full transparency, like a lot of the conversations at Servants of Christ for the past few weeks has been about the utter unsustainability of our finances. And when you start to break down our cost structure, that paying me a middle-class wage is the second biggest line item on our budget, on a budget that we can't bear. And that becomes like a really difficult conversation, because when you just break down the raw numbers of it between our church and the support we get currently from outside, we have to bear our overall clergy costs are, I could give it some rough numbers, about $180,000 a year is what it costs the overall system to pay for there to be 2 full-time clergy here at Servants of Christ. Mm-hmm. And in an environment where we are very financially short all of the time, that also means that any idea that we have to change the trajectory of this church has to kind of immediately bear an extra $180,000 that's very difficult to do. Has to work really big.
It has to be financially sustainable immediately. It makes it very difficult to take risks, to be agile, to do the things that would be interesting to try in ministry, but that you don't know if it's going to be a sure thing. You don't know if it's going to hit or not.
If day one, the question is, and then, and for us, there is also the fixed cost of insurance, right? Which is this whole other, whatever. But so on day one, anything that we do has to bear between pastor costs and insurance, nearest makes a difference, $300,000 a year.
And be sustainable.
Mm-hmm.
It is. And fully financed.
Right. And on top of I have felt many of the emotions that man describes, that full-time clergy suffer from. And I know a lot of my colleagues who feel those same things. And he makes the case that essentially, look, this is a causal relationship between being miserable in ministry and being full-time. And I don't know. Right. I do wonder if there is a causative relationship between being the person who has found themselves at the top of a church's letterhead full-time and being mildly miserable. I know some happier associates, but maybe that's just because I'm not an associate anymore. But there is something for being responsible for this show that I think is certainly bears a huge psychological toll in my own life. And is, a few weeks back when Reagan and I talked, right? Reagan, that's something Reagan and I share, is both being the people that the denomination has decided is fundamentally responsible. I want to bring in another article that we'll post in the show notes. So there was a Fresh Expressions conference that the United Methodist Church put on called the Futuring Forward, the Reawakening of the People Called Methodist. It was early February. Some folks from our annual conference went to it. It's in North Carolina. And one of the articles to come out of this is an article entitled Fresh Expressions Needed in Funding Too. And it a lot of what this article talks about is that one of the great things about Fresh Expressions is you can run them in a very lean fashion, right? That it does not cost much money to start an innovative small group at a bar, because you don't own the bar, and you're just showing up and running a small group. And so while Fresh Expressions needs some funding, one of their joys is that they can be done in a very lean fashion, in a way that traditional church, just as I spend so much of my life talking about can't run in a particularly lean manner. Because we've got we have a literal bomb worth of poop sitting under our activities building right now, and we got a quote back. We're only gonna have to spend about $10,000 to fix it, but there was some chance that we're gonna have to spend $80,000 to fix it. And
all the things you didn't know you wanted to know about church life.
Yeah,
sometimes there's literal poop that you gotta take care of under the building.
It's called a belly, but as far as I can tell, what a belly is just like a gathering. The pipe has shifted and there's a gathering of poop under the building that, if that really blows, compromises the entire foundation of the church. And when buildings enter into it, there's always a chance that there's a bomb of poop under your building.
Literal poop under the building that has to be dealt with.
We will not be naming this episode "There is a bomb of poop."
but there's a bomb of poop. There is a bomb of poop, and you have to deal with it. And this is not the first church building where we've had to deal with a poop issue or a plumbing issue.
Right.
These things happen. As soon as you have a building in play, you're talking insurance, you're talking big overhead. You can't really run lean, so you can't really be agile in your directions of ministry like you may want to be.
And it becomes a lot of, especially in low resource environments, you really start to internalize that the funding structure of a modern mainline church really assumes that everybody involved is making 110% of what they need.
Right.
And a lot of the training that I got in fundraising was, how do you ask your rich people for money? And how do you help teach people about the faithfulness of tithing? And I'm very comfortable in that. But when someone finds my rich people, please tell me, because I would love to talk to them. But they're not here, right? Our folks are either barely getting by because they're new to this country, or literal children, or on a fixed income. And we don't really have the in-between. And so the vast majority of our folks are not making 110% of what they need. And so they give what they can to the church, but that doesn't, plate giving, even right now, is a small percentage of what makes the show go.
Right. Well, but, and that it's addressed in this article as well, that the kingdom of God is for those people that don't have two dimes to rub together. And so how do you do ministry with and for these folks without expecting plate giving, right?
Yeah.
How do you do that without expecting people to tithe, or whose tithe is going to be mowing the lawn, right?
Right. And so all of these things, right? And what the idea of part-time clergy, who may actually be happier than full-time clergy, gets at is that, like, how do you run leaner and more sustainably? Because that is going to be a real question if this isn't going to boil down to a handful of very large, very rich mainline churches. Because that's kind of the trajectory that things feel headed towards. It's not that the mainline churches are going to go away. It's that medium-sized and smaller mainline churches will go away. And what will remain are the folks with 1,000+ people in worship, who are largely upper middle class. And there are plenty of churches that have a lot of, I hang out at my other church is St. Paul's United Methodist Church. If my family was, because they have ministry to people like us, middle class young families. So they have a parents' night out because they have we're going to their egg hunt on Saturday. Right. And so they're right. So it's not even about older people. I hang out with a lot of, 30 and 40 somethings from St. Paul's. Mm-hmm. My best friend in the world is a 30 something at St. Paul's. And so St. Paul's has its own struggles, but it's not that living hand to mouth the way that we are. And so, I can imagine a world that in 15 years there is a St. Paul's UMC doing wonderful stuff, and St. Luke's UMC doing wonderful stuff, and I just know Methodist World here in Houston, and Chapelwood UMC out west.
Right.
But anything outside of that weight class, we are all just living hand to mouth. And building insurance is part of that. And clergy compensation is part of that. And apparently it's making us all miserable.
It does make you start to feel like the little Dutch boy with his finger in the dam. You're just plugging the holes. And it becomes your responsibility as lead clergy to do that, right? It's your job to hold up the entire dam, not just your section of it. And so how do we change that mindset? How do we get people to, run things differently? So maybe it's this Fresh Expressions movement where people can run leaner. Maybe it's just realizing that the future of the church funding is not in plate giving, Maybe it's getting creative.
Well, and the idea of bivocational pastors is, I've done it. I know a lot of people who have, and there is, it is a different way of living. Now, the other piece I want to bring into this conversation, because you and I have run into this time to time, because we tend to work, at least at this stage of our career, in places where there's not a ton of money. And so that means that if you are a full-time pastor making middle-class money, as our minimum salaries, and I make above the minimum salary, dictate, odds are you're making more than the people who are paying you.
Yes.
Right? You're making more than the people you're serving. And maybe you are, what is the whatever is the Proverbs? I don't know. I quote this and I never know where it's from, that a laborer is worth their wage, right? Maybe that's true, but there was a time where I was at Grace, where I made more than the average citizen of Palestine, Texas. That salary was best salary I've ever had in my life, frankly. I made more than the average citizen of Palestine, Texas. And the church finances weren't going. And to sustain my salary, we would have to lay people off. And we had to go through a real soul searching, and we actually cut that salary. And I got a lot of flack and a lot of quarters. And I was the one, the church didn't propose this. I proposed this, that we cut my salary so that we wouldn't have to lay off people. And there's all this logic that says never cut your salary because you're setting up the person that comes after you. And I understand that, but also were we supposed to then lay people off? And that's really hard, especially when we were not in an affluent area. We're not in an affluent area now. And in both cases, I make more than the people around us.
Right. But also the cost of living is up.
Yeah.
So, so being bivocational, finding a way to be part-time clergy and part-time anything else, there's a million side hustles out there, may be part of the answer to help fund the church and keep the mass exodus of pastors from leaving from the mental load of having to find their salaries and finance the church. So.
Right. Because, at some point, when I have gotten raises, I kind of laugh. It's nice, but I still have to then raise that money. Right. Okay, you've been given a raise, thank you. But also, I have just upped our run rate, and our run rate
now you have to go find it.
Tends to be the thing that's killing me. Killing me softly. And there is a real need on the creative end of ministry. What we have run into, and I think this Fresh Expressions article bears out, that on the creative end of ministry, there is a need for leanness.
Yes.
In part, so that you can be creative, that high overhead drives conservatism, essentially. And certainly does in me, or maybe not, but I also, like, this digital ministry that we are doing here. If I had to make a business case for it, there isn't one. It does actually reach more people than our Sunday morning English service does. And so by doing this, we reach more people, hopefully in a format that connects with folks in an interesting way. But there's not a real business case for this. I'm just doing this because I'm mildly nuts.
But, I mean, this is where the examples like, the Christian nightclub that we looked at. Low overhead, meets once a month.
Low overhead.
But makes huge strides in the kingdom of God by building real intentional community for people who need it.
The article doesn't get into it, and maybe someday we should figure out how to interview those guys. But I'm willing to bet that that's nobody's full-time job.
Right.
And certainly they are not paying building insurance. They are probably have uninsurance responsibility because they are probably, to rent out a nightclub, I suspect you have to be some sort of entity, like legal entity. Right. And that legal entity has some sort of insurance burden, because often to rent those kinds of spaces, this is real, like in the weeds, often to rent those kinds of spaces, you have to prove insurance. Okay? So it's not that they have no insurance.
Or no overhead, right? There's some overhead to doing that, but it's much leaner.
Much lower. Much leaner.
Than owning a sanctuary.
Yeah. That might actually have a poop bomb. They don't have to pay for their own poop bombs. There's a literal bomb of poop. Yeah. It's a problem. It's terrifying.
It is.
And I find it fascinating. Right? That, and have felt it in my own life, that there's a real joy when this religion can be vocation and not profession.
Yes.
That your relationship, and this is the thing they don't warn you about in seminary, or they certainly didn't warn me about in seminary, that I periodically try to warn y'all about, is something changes when this is the thing you do, rather than a thing you do. That we should all be living our lives for our faith all the time. That's not what I mean. But it's a real different thing when the faith is the thing you do as your main living.
As that your is, means of living. Yes.
That is different.
When your passion becomes your profession, it is different. And that's true of every person who has tried to turn their passion into a side hustle.
Yeah.
Right? If you love to crochet and then all of a sudden you have a crocheting business and then you hate it. Yes, it does change things when it becomes your financial profession.
Right. And so in some ways, this guy, I don't know how old Jeffery MacDonald is, but the way to phrase it is, rather than this being your hustle, ministry as your side hustle.
Yes.
It lowers the overhead and gives you that different relationship, even with the relative success or lack of success in your ministry. When it's the sole thing you do for a living and the thing doesn't work.
What do you
do? What are we going to eat?
Yeah.
Whereas if it's the supplemental thing, I still got this other stuff to fall back on.
Right.
If you have experience in this, either as a full-time clergy or as a part-time clergy or in a church that it's been through this, we would love to hear that. thegoodnessofgodpod@gmail.com. thegoodnessofgodpod@gmail.com. This and everything else we do here in the Media Lab is literally only possible because of a generous Innovators Grant for the Textennial Conference of the United Methodist Church. If you want to help make this ministry make mildly more sense, like, comment, subscribe, and leave us 5-star reviews on Apple Podcast. All of that helps this at least reach more folks, which helps the impact of this time that we spend go further. And also go in peace to love and serve the Lord. We'll see you next time.